I thought I'd show you guys today kind of my seedling selection process. So one of the cool things about growing thousands of cactus seedlings is that when they get to a certain size, I can start to see what the genetic traits are. These, those, they're all at the point where, the differences are starting to really show. When they're like this or like these right here, you really can't tell that much yet. Like these are just starting to show more of their genetic characteristics, but they're still a little bit young. When they get to say like this size right here, you start to see more differences. With the types that tend to have smaller spines, I'm looking for a combination of small spines, girth, or I want them to be tall and fat. That's like the holy grail, right? So going through here, for instance, I could say maybe like this one here looks interesting, or that one there. Ouch. But the height to thickness ratio is more toward just tall and skinny. And I think that, by this point, they're really showing what they're going to do. And I try to make the spacing big enough that they don't, and I grow them in natural light so they're not like tall and skinny. So if you grow them under too unnatural light or too crowded or in too much shade, they will tend to just grow real finger-like, and then it becomes harder to tell that particular characteristic. So this is the tightest spacing I use, which is 365 seeds per flat. I use also like a 1-inch spacing and a 7/8, I think. I think it's 3/4, 7/8. Yeah, and 1-inch. So this may be a 1-inch spacing, but you can see like these are real vigorous and they're really still not that crowded. So you really can see the difference in, the height ratio there. So I've already made my selections out of these, but for instance, like things that jump out at me in this flat is like that looks really tall, but the ratio is a little bit skewed toward height, or is that one right there is tall, but it also looks pretty fat. Like I'm tempted to pull that one out. Same with this one right here. Now with the Burgessii, they're more spiny, so I'm still looking for the same thing, but I mostly ignore the spine size unless the spine size is really, really large and I think it's going to produce like huge thorns. Like for instance, this one looks pretty good and it was actually marked. See, I marked it here with a toothpick, so I was keeping an eye on that one. I don't know why I didn't pull it out. I may just have missed it. But it is tall, and it's as tall as probably anything in here, but it's still chubby and fat, and that's what I'm looking for in Burgessii. I want big, fat Burgessii. They grow fast. So that one there looks interesting too. Maybe that one. So there's a few in here that are still jumping out at me, even though I've already made selections. So I may go back through here again. So these are seeds that I got from Peru. They're from Matacana, Peru, and they're open pollinated Pachanoe seeds. Because they're open pollinated and they're collected from a lot of different cactus, I'm going to see a high variability in here of different genetics. There's some that tend to be super fat like this. Like see how chubby and fat that is? That's really cool. But they tend to have bigger spines. Like that one looks really interesting right there, for instance. So, same thing in here, but there's a much higher genetic diversity because this is from, lots and lots of different plants. I got a lot of seed from Roscarau, and it's like, I think it's 18 different Pachanoe, but they're all open pollinated with each other. So all I have is like the mother name, the seed parent name, like Churchill here, VMP, but then they're open pollinated with all the other Pachanoes that came with the pack. So that's really cool, and that's one thing I've been wanting to do, and that's one of my goals in the long run is to establish isolated populations of selected clones toward gathering open pollinated seed, but the seed gene pool will be really high quality, and so you get this huge amount of genetic diversity in the seed, and it'll be super cheap to produce. Here's a couple of really cool crested seedlings from last year, and this is the Oscar TPQC seed from Misplant, which throws a super high rate of mutants. Not all of them will show up early, like for instance this is a flat of them, and I can tell that that's a mutant, that's a mutant, that's a mutant. I have some other ones marked in here and I've already pulled some out, but some of them will only show it a little bit later, and they vary from everything from multi-headed to crests and everything in between. These are some of the seedlings I picked out this year. I'll make a first selection that's like what I think are probably going to be the best, most interesting seedlings. Again, you know, fat and tall. That one looks awesome. These are Mallow-4 Wonkabambas, which seem to be extra vigorous. Here's some cool Oscar TPQC cress already, a bunch of those. And these here are the rest of this year's selection so far. So again, some of the flats, maybe half the flats, aren't really ready to select yet. I think I have about 150 seedlings selected out so far, so I'll probably end up with about 250 to 300 selections. Once those grow for another year, it'll look like this. So these are last year's seedlings that looked exactly like that last fall. I make a second selection, right? So these all here are the second selection of what I think are the best stuff out of the first selection from last year. So these are arranged roughly, mostly in rows of the same thing or close to it. Same cross, you know. These Jessica, I think that's Jessica TPQC, very vigorous. That's Oscar TPQC. No, that's Oscar Mallow-4. Yeah, that's Oscar Mallow-4. Don't sleep on the Mallow-4 crosses. They are big, vigorous, fat cactus. Okay, so all of these are the leftovers from last year's seedlings that I decided not to keep, so these all sell. And, you know, it could just vary, like, maybe they just didn't turn out to be quite as vigorous as the other selections. I just don't want to keep too many. So a lot of this stuff is great. And again, I did select it out originally. Like, that one looks really good. Every time I come in here, I'm like, maybe I should keep that one. But yeah, you know, I can only keep so many, so. Okay, so these are from the year before. And these would be a lot bigger, but I left them in 4-inch pots. So take a look at the size of these, roughly. And I fertilized and watered these very similar to those. But these were transplanted into gallon pots early last, like late spring probably. And you can see how much more they've grown. Now these are also the best selections from that year, and these are the ones that I decided maybe I won't keep. Anyway, if you want your cactus to grow, you gotta feed them and water them. I feed probably every 3 weeks. You know, when they get this big, you really start to see the differences. Like this bomber right here looks super promising. I mean, look, if we look down at it this way, look how fat that is compared to most of this other stuff. This one here looks pretty cool. It's not as thick, but it just has a neat fat look to it. It's starting to get kind of notchy, not too many ribs. It's 5 ribs. Out of these, like this might be my favorite, this little blunt bomber right here. It's like super shallow grooves. I almost fell all the way out. Very small spines. A little slower growing than the other ones. And this is a cross between like a scope, a pack, and a bridge. Scope number 10 crossed with an SSO2 BBG cross. So pretty complex heritage, and they throw everything from these really packy looking notchy things to basically what look like bridges with maybe a little bit short spines. And those could be very interesting and, you know, other characteristics that cactus people may want in a cactus. So another thing to notice here is that all of these blocks of cactus are treated exactly the same. Like I try to use the same soil mix, and then I keep them in blocks by year and by type, and then I fertilize them and water them pretty consistent. Not like super consistent, but pretty consistent, you know. And that allows me to say that, well, if I'm seeing differences in these cactus, it's probably genetic versus environmental, right? That's what I want, because then I can really make comparisons and see what's what. As I go along and observe them and see their growth habits or assay them for whatever other characteristics I might want to check for, then I know that they've been treated the same under the same conditions. Enough that it gives me some confidence that I'm comparing the cactus to each other for real and not to like all these different other factors that could confound the process. But again, if you want your cactus to grow, pot them up and feed them. Again, I feed probably every 3 weeks, and I water pretty consistently. Here in the summer it's hot. These pots I try to water about every 3 days, not too much longer than that. And sometimes I go a lot longer, but you know, they don't need to dry out, and they prefer to have consistent water. If you want them to grow and pump up, this is what they're going to look like versus that if you just leave them in too small of a pot. And the same will be true if I leave some of these in 1-gallon pots and put some of them in 2-gallon pots. You know, you're going to see the difference, and I'll show you the difference. So the bigger block of cactus we were just looking at were planted the same year as these. These are like the super selections, like the most desirable selections from that 2020 season. These are not that 3-way cross though. These are a scope with Jules Giant. And I'm going to show you some of these that are, you know, should be genetically very similar. And the same thing, like 6 of the best selections. I'm talking about this row, like right here, that I left in 1-gallon pots because I ran out of 2-gallon pots and I never got any more. You'll be able to see the size difference. We'll come back here in a second. So these would look more like those other ones, which are closer to this size maybe, but I left them in the 1-gallon pots. And again, I fertilize them pretty similar to those. It's just, you know, they have more room to grow, more water, etc. And again, these, for whatever reason, were the ultimate selections out of that 2020 year for scope number 10 with Jules Giant. That one I'm going to get rid of because it's too skinny. This one looks great. It's super blunt and fat and has tiny spines. I like the looks of this one. That one looks okay. This one, not so much, although it's kind of cool in blue. That same year as that and the other block we just looked at, I got this out, but I took it out super early. It was in a flat of seedlings and it just looks super, super bright green and different than all the other seedlings. And I pulled it out at like maybe 3/4 of an inch tall or less. And I put it into maybe like a 1-gallon pot. And by the end of that season, it was pretty big already because I got it out so early. And then, you know, this year I got it potted up early and, you know, that's the difference. So the sooner you can get them into bigger pots and get them growing fast, it makes all the difference. It really does. And I just love this cactus. It's real chubby, kind of spiny, like for what I'm generally looking for, smaller spines, but that's just a really cool one. And I called it Green Kingdom. Like when I pulled it out this big and I thought that's super green. And I just like to name stuff because it's easier to keep track of the numbers and it's fun. I love naming plants. It's one of my favorite parts of plant breeding. So I don't know, it just came to my head. I just wrote Green Kingdom on the tag and that's what the tag says. So this one here is probably my favorite looking cactus out of everything I've grown from seed so far that's gotten big enough to be, you know, noticeably different and unique and cool. I could tell this was special when it was about, you know, 2 inches tall or less. I was like, that looks really cool. It was, you know, it has the shallow grooves, like very shallow grooves. So it's super chubby. It just had this super flat, like fat looking top, and it's just turning out to be really cool, notchy, smooth looking cactus. So that's named King Tubby because when it was just a little seedling, it just looked all like chubby and fat. And I was like, listening to a bunch of King Tubby is like my favorite dub artist. And I like naming stuff. I don't really get the don't name cactus thing. I don't really understand what the argument is. It creates a lot of confusion to try to use numbers. It's much easier to mix up a number, just like one digit, or lose track, or remember what they're called, or tell someone and remember that a number is like mixed up. But it's pretty hard to forget King Tubby. Pot them up early, over pot them in big pots. Make sure they're wet enough consistently. You know, I mean, again, it doesn't matter if they dry out all the way. It's just like, they don't want to stay dry, you know, they don't want to be dry, they want resources so they can grow. Just don't keep them soggy and use plenty of aggregate. I use a lot of charcoal, which is, it just works really well for making a nice aerated soil. I've used about 50% charcoal in everything. It's a lot of charcoal though when you're producing a lot of potting soil. So this graft here, that little top piece, is that scope number 10 X SSO2 X BBG. That's looking great. I'm stoked about that one. And this graft here is one of the seedlings of number 10 scope with Jules Giant, and it's also looking quite nice and chubby. Okay, so that's my plan basically. Grow out thousands of seedlings in trays, try to get the conditions uniform enough that I think I'm seeing genetic differences by the time they get like 3/4 of an inch and taller or fatter. So I can make selections based on what I think the genetics are. Pull those, grow those out for a year, make a second selection of the best stuff from that, grow those out, cull those again another time, and just keep kind of thinning them out to the very best cactus I can. That's kind of what I get to do that's super exciting and fun about growing just like thousands and thousands of cactus seedlings. I probably grew 8,000 seedlings this year, so I have lots for sale, and if I can sell all those, I'll grow that many or more next year.